53 years ago this week, the Indian Army salvaged much of its lost reputation in the 1962 war. That's the subject of Simply Nitin this week. I am Nitin Gokhale. So the 60s, particularly mid-60s, were a much turbulent time for India. The 1962 war with China had left many scars on the collective psyche of the Indian nation and the people. And of course, India lost its first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, who passed away in May 1964. Then, briefly, Lal Bahadur Shastri tried to restore the glory, and of course, the Indian Army won the battle with Pakistan in the 1965 war. But the joy was short-lived. Prime Minister Shastri suddenly passed away in Tashkent after signing a peace accord with Pakistan. Then an inexperienced Indira Gandhi became the Prime Minister. In the meantime, Northeast was aflame. The Naga Hills were beset with the insurgency launched by AZ Fizo, which was more than 12 years old. And then in the Mizo Hills, another insurgency sprung up. In North Bengal, in the Darjeeling district, a new trouble arose with the farmers there taking law into their hand, and a small revolution that of course was to spread further afield began in a village called Naxalbari. This was 1967. In fact, the Chinese were part of many of the troubles that India was facing. In the Northeast, they were fueling the insurgency, actively aiding and abetting the insurgent groups, giving them shelter, giving them training, even supplying them with weapons. So when the spring thunder broke over Darjeeling or over North Bengal, the People's Daily, the official organ of the Communist Party of China, actually wrote in an article, "Spring Thunder over India." And of course, they were gleeful that India was going through lots of internal trouble. Simultaneously, the Chinese were not allowing India to forget that the border with China, or the Indo-Tibet border, was not settled, and of course, they kept on creeping forward, as has been their wont since 1962. In the Sikkim area and close to Sikkim, in the Doklam plateau, which is at the tri-junction of India, Tibet and Sikkim, the Chinese were increasingly intruding into Bhutan, which was still then, or even later, was a protectorate of India. The responsibility of providing security to Bhutan and Sikkim was with India. There were constant to and fro between the diplomats and between the governments of India and China over these intrusions, over where exactly the border, which was not yet fully called as line of actual control between India and China, lay. And in the middle of all this, there was an incident which happened at two places, but today we are mainly talking about the incident at Nathula, or the Nathula Pass that connects Sikkim to Tibet. This happened in the week between 11 September and 14 September 1967, exactly 53 years ago. What happened at Nathula? Nathula is a pass which allowed traffic to go from Sikkim to Tibet for trade, for tourism, for pilgrimage. The subjects of Sikkim used to go into Tibet and also trade with Tibet in those days. Now, that is where the Indian and the Chinese posts were created, and they were facing each other, constantly running into each other, as has been the pattern for so many years now, for 60 years. Even there used to be constant clashes, there used to be fisticuffs. Same old story as we are hearing even currently in Ladakh, and sometimes we hear in Sikkim and Arunachal Pradesh. Now, at Nathula, the divisional commander, Major General Sagat Singh, who was commanding the 17 Mountain Division headquartered in Gangtok, actually wanted the border to be demarcated so that his troops could go up to that particular border and patrol without running into the Chinese. So he started a small project on his own to lay barbed wire along the watershed that marked the Nathula Pass. So on both east and west of the Nathula Pass, he ordered the two battalions that were under him there at the Nathula Pass to lay concertina barbed wire fence so that the Chinese and the Indian border can be demarcated. Now the Chinese, of course, objected to it, and for almost a month from middle of August, this trouble and the constant friction between the Chinese troops and the Indian troops continued when the Indians started laying down the barbed wire. There were heated exchanges and constant speaking to each other on loudspeakers at that border, but Sagat Singh was determined to lay the border, or at least mark the border once and for all, so that the troops could easily understand up to which point they could patrol. Now, in this pattern, there was a Chinese objection that you cannot mark the border because it is the job of the political and the diplomatic officials, and we are not supposed to do this. The political commissar, who is always embedded in the Chinese unit, used to come forward and object to this, and there used to be heated exchanges. At one point, there were fisticuffs, and the political commissar, the senior most official in that unit, got injured. He was in fact roughed up by a company of Jat soldiers who were posted at that place. In fact, the units which were posted there were the two grenadiers and a Gorkha unit, which was a newly raised unit. Two grenadiers was from one of the oldest units of the Indian Army. Now, while this roughing up of the political commissar happened, the decision in the Indian camp was that no matter what the Chinese say, we must complete this job. So on 10th or 11th of September, when the laying of the wire commenced or recommenced, the Chinese came, objected, angrily said that you cannot continue with this, but within 10 minutes they ran back to their posts, and in no time they opened heavy machine gun fire on the unsuspecting Indians who were laying the barbed wire. So in the first instance of that firing from the Chinese side, the Indians lost over 60 soldiers killed. It seemed as if this is going to be another 1962, a military rout, a military defeat. But Sagat Singh was made of sterner stuff. He had camped himself in the brigade headquarters not very far from Nathula. He came to the Nathula post and rallied the troops. And of course, the return fire started. And at one point, the Chinese, having realized that the return fire, the retaliatory fire had started, retreated into their bunkers. So the Chinese couldn't be hit or couldn't be targeted. But within a couple of days, Sagat Singh decided that he will use the heavy artillery. Now, one of the officers who I know was a young lieutenant that time, who retired as Major General, Sheru Thapliyal, was on his first posting as an artillery observation officer in Sikkim. He remembers very clearly that Sagat Singh said, I want to open the artillery fire, heavy artillery fire on the Chinese bunkers, Chinese posts that are barely less than a kilometer away from where the Indian posts were. But the catch was that neither Sagat Singh, who was a divisional commander, nor his boss, Jagjit Singh Arora, who was the corps commander in Siliguri, were authorized to open fire with artillery guns. They are heavy caliber weapons, and that means escalation if artillery guns are used. So they asked for permission from Eastern Command, which is in Calcutta. Then the Eastern Army commander was the legendary Sam Manekshaw. But that time Sam Manekshaw was in Delhi officiating as the army chief. He couldn't be reached in time, and nobody else would take a decision in the army headquarters. So Sagat Singh said, I am going to take the responsibility irrespective of the fact that I do not have the authority to use artillery guns. He opened up the artillery guns ruthlessly on the Chinese posts there and demolished, completely decimated the Chinese company or whatever the strength that was there on the other side of Nathula, on the Chinese side. 388 and more Chinese lay dead. India lost eventually 88 soldiers. And of course, then all hell broke loose. Apparently, when Mrs. Gandhi, who was the Prime Minister, was told about this permission that was sought by Sagat Singh, she immediately said, go ahead. But Sagat had taken his career in his own hands and had taken the risk to turn the tables in Nathula. If this had not happened, and if the Indians had accepted the defeat on the first day, perhaps the story of the 1962 rout would have continued. When we look back now, 53 years later, it was Sagat's bold and innovative decision to take matters in his own hand, despite the fact that he didn't have the authority, that turned the tables in Nathula and gave the Chinese a bloody nose. They never came back to attack or do retaliation against Indians at Nathula. To date, Nathula remains a border personnel meeting point between Indian and the Chinese armies, high up there above Gangtok, in the border between Sikkim and Tibet. And of course, Sagat Singh went on to become a big hero, not just in Nathula, but later he was posted to Mizoram, where he brought the insurgency under control between 68 and 1970. By the time he became a Lieutenant General, he was given the command of 4 Corps in Tejpur, which acquitted itself commendably in the 1971 war. And of course, the famous para drop at Tangail in East Pakistan was ordered by Sagat Singh. Sam Manekshaw, who was the Eastern Army commander, was the army chief in 1971. Jagjit Singh Arora, who was the corps commander in Nathula, or during the Nathula clash in 67, was the Eastern Army commander, who actually accepted the surrender by Lieutenant General A.A.K. Niazi in Dhaka. All of you know that iconic photograph where Niazi is signing the instrument of surrender in Dhaka when the Indian Army won the 13-day war against Pakistan. The foundation of that glorious victory, in my view, in 1971, were laid in two instances. One, the 1965 war, which India sort of, within 3 years of the military defeat in 62, turned the tide in the 1965 war against Pakistan, and the 67 clash in Nathula, which was a tactical victory, had strategic ramifications, because after that, for nearly 20 years, there was complete peace between India and China on the entire line of actual control because of what Sagat and his men, the brave men of the Gorkha unit and the Grenadiers unit, and of course Sagat and his team in the 17 Mountain Division did. The Chinese were afraid. There were, of course, other irritants in the relationship between India and China that year in 1967. The embassies of the two countries in their respective capitals were attacked. 2 Indian diplomats were roughed up. They were tried by the Chinese for allegedly spying against the Chinese for taking photographs of some cantonment. In Delhi, the Chinese embassy was under siege. Chinese diplomats were expelled. They were attacked. They were injured. All kinds of things happened in 1967. But the watershed moment was the Nathula clash, in which the Chinese were routed. They lost, as I said, more than 388 soldiers. Of course, within a month after that clash, there was another clash at Chola, not very far from Nathula, but that's a smaller of the incidents that happened. But that's the kind of watershed moment in the India-China history. Even as we witness another round of extremely high tension between Indian and Chinese armies in Ladakh, which has been continuing since May 2020. That's all I have in this week's episode. I thought this is important to recall because these are the kind of incidents, one small incident can become turning points in the history or in the kind of interaction two armies do, or how two armies regard each other. That's the way it happened in Nathula. In fact, if you want to know more about it in detail, there is a book by an ex-army officer, Prabal Das Gupta, who has written a book on the Nathula incident and of course the geopolitics around it and what happened in those years in the mid-60s. Do go and check out that book. But in the meantime, do keep sending us feedback, like us on our social media platforms, and as usual, your comments are welcome. I'll meet you again next week in a similar episode of Simply Nitin.